you for to our department officials for joining us today. I'm just I know there's been a lot of discussion around the business directory of Indigenous peoples partners, and do you think transferring the directory away from Government of Canada will lead to more integrity in procurement practices?
I would not be able to answer that. I don't
Okay.
know.
In the way, in the current context, would it be harder for Indigenous businesses to be competitive with non-Indigenous businesses when bidding for contracts if they were restricted to, say, a narrower pool of resources to draw from?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So if there if the say, let's say the business directory is managed outside, or organized outside, like, and would they have less resources from, say, the government of Canada having the business directory, managing the business directory, or at least adding and members to it or not?
So I would not be able to answer that question. I don't know the workforce behind managing the IBD within Indigenous Services Canada, and I don't know how they would, if other firms were involved in the registration, how that would be managed. And those are discussions and questions probably best answered by Indigenous Services Canada, actually.
Okay. I'm going to go into the supply manual. The PSPC supply manual states, in support of PSIB, client departments may designate that a proportion of subcontracts through open procurement be reserved for Indigenous business, or that non-Indigenous suppliers are to be encouraged through the use of incentives. An example is additional evaluation points to hire Indigenous businesses as subcontractors. Can you explain to us what evaluation points are in the contracting process?
So when we develop a procurement or a request for proposal, we will outline how we will evaluate a supplier, and various points are associated with meeting certain criteria. And as long as a company is able to outline those criterias and how they will meet them, and we will associate certain points to them meeting those particular criteria. So we have to be fully transparent on how we're going to evaluate the bids so that it is fair, open, and transparent to all bidders.
Okay, and there's a set number of extra evaluation points that can be awarded for hiring an Indigenous subcontractor?
I think it's a plan that they would incorporate in their contract, or they may have. So yes, there could be some points provided for having a subcontractor being an Indigenous firm.
And they're awarded by PSPC or the contracting department?
So the PSPC, when it's a common service provider, can do that on behalf of other government departments, or for PSPC when we purchase on our own, when PSPC is a client of the acquisitions program.
Okay. The prime contractor is responsible to bind its subcontractors in writing to PSIB requirements, including requirements for the subcontractors to send information substantiating its compliance with the program. So who's responsible for enforcing these requirements? The prime contractor, ISC, or PSPC?
So the enforcement, I believe, would be done by Indigenous Services Canada. We can always ask them to audit to make sure that what has been identified in the evaluation, and then when we were providing the contract, if we require a validation, we would go to Indigenous Services Canada to do the audit.
Okay, so what measures are in place to ensure that all involved parties comply to these prerequisites? What actions taken if a prime contractor or subcontractor does not meet the requirements set out?
Brief
by
answer, because we're past our time.
Okay, so there are some contractual clauses, and if they are not meeting it, then at that point, those contractual clauses would actually come into play, and you either terminate or you actually provide, like, there might be remedies outlined in the actual procurement itself.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Baines. We'll now go to Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Paquette, regarding the report on achieving the 5% goal for 2022-2023, there's about $1.6 billion given to Indigenous businesses. This represents 6.27% of contracts. How much is being spent on contracts on average in Canada for all businesses? I believe that for the federal government, that's about $36 billion per year, or 34 perhaps. And we have 24 billion at PSPC. If I do some quick math here, I'll be nice. $2 billion out of $36 billion, 5.5%, and I was generous, I added 400 million. We're not at 6.27% of contracts. I believe that we're mixing the amounts awarded for these contracts with the number of contracts. Is that possible? If you're speaking to what's in my report, I'm only talking about contracts for PSPC. When I spoke of the $34 billion, that was throughout the federal government at large. $24 billion is for PSPC, but it's also when contracts are awarded to other departments. Yes, that I had understood. We had 2.6% of our contracts that were awarded to Indigenous businesses in 2022-2023. That's at PSPC. But this policy applies to all organizations, not only PSPC. It applies to all organizations, but for some, including PSPC, there were some that started in 2022. There are organizations that started later than that. So we have 3 years from 2022 to the end of 24-25 to reach that target of 5%. I can only speak to PSPC and how we are working hard in order to reach that 5% and perhaps have more even than 5% going to Indigenous businesses. I'm talking about the difference between the number of contracts and the value of the contracts. Currently, we're looking at the value of contracts or for the number of contracts, because that's very different. I know my time is up, Mr. Chair. We're talking about the value.
Have a quick response, or would you like to get back to us in the next round?
I think it's on the value of the contracts from what I've read. So I would say that it's on the 5% target is related to contract value and not the number of contracts.
Okay. We'll go to Mr. Backrack, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Paquette, the 5% target, but there remain serious concerns regarding the integrity of the business directory. Have you really met the target?
We have not met the target within PSPC, which I actually mentioned in the opening remarks. And what we are doing right now is a lot of effort through engagement with Indigenous businesses to see how we can actually meet that target, how we can, find out a little bit more about where they're able to procure or be part of our procurement processes, how we could actually direct more of our procurements toward Indigenous firms.
I guess maybe my question wasn't clear enough. It just seems like the 5% target is a box ticking exercise because PSPC does not have any concerns with the integrity of the directory or the definition of what an Indigenous business is. It just takes holus bolus, whatever Indigenous Services Canada says is an Indigenous business, and tries to hit the target based on that list. Now, I think you would agree with me that if you hit the 5% target for Indigenous procurement, but the businesses that get the contracts aren't necessarily Indigenous businesses, you haven't really hit the target, have you?
We are following the rules set by the government to meet a 5% target. If we actually exceed that, we'll be happy about that. We are
will you be
abiding by the
not?
rule that the IBD certifies these companies, and we need to use the IBD to identify the 5%.
Yeah, and the challenge here, of course, is that there are major questions about the IBD, and those have been raised consistently over the course of this study. But it seems to me that PSPC is not concerned at all with the integrity of the directory. You're simply staying in your lane and ticking the box and trying to get to 5%, which is frustrating because the role of PSPC, as I understand it, is to ensure the integrity of government procurement generally across the federal government. And it does seem in this case like PSPC is not fulfilling that role. But I'll move to the statement earlier in the last round that
Mr. Backrack, I'm afraid we're past time, but you'll have another round. So
okay.
If we can get
Thanks,
next
Mr.
round.
Chair.
Mrs. Block, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up on my previous round, you have kept saying that this program is run by Indigenous Services and that you have no oversight of the program. However, PSPC is required to award 5% of contracts per year to Indigenous businesses through this program, and has a requirement of that program, 33% of subcontractors must be Indigenous. Why then is PSPC not verifying that this subcontracted work is being done by Indigenous businesses?
We refer the information to Indigenous Services Canada, and they can perform audits to ensure that the companies are meeting the requirements and maintain their certification.
And then do you receive these audited reports back to confirm that you are actually meeting the 5% target?
We would receive those reports back by Indigenous Services Canada and incorporate them in our files.
So I would just say that by not verifying the work being done by subcontractors, you are virtually admitting that your department is opening this program to fraud. When fraud is committed in government contracting, such as a business posing as an Indigenous business to win a contract. Is PSPC the department that is responsible for getting back the money once that company has been exposed as not being Indigenous?
There are some contractual terms that manage the contract. If we have if something happens and a company who was previously certified and they actually met the certification, but yet no longer meet the certification once we've actually awarded the contract and the contract is still live, then the contractual clauses and terms and conditions of that contract will come into play.
So you could then get the money back.
I would not be able to say that we're going to get any money back. It all depends. You know, they meet the certification at the time we put the contract in place. If at any time, once we've put the contract in place, a company no longer meets the certification and we terminate at that time, then they have done the work during that time and we owe them the money for the work that they've done.
So in relation to the Arrive scam scandal, PSPC stated that they could get the money back from fraudulent contracting. I am not sure what you mean by a company meeting the certification when you award the contract and then somewhere along the line not meeting the certification along the way if it has been verified that they are an Indigenous business. But my question to you would be, can your department commit to reviewing the contracts awarded through this program and recovering any money spent on contracts awarded to non-Indigenous businesses that were posing as Indigenous?
I'm unable to answer that question because I don't know.
Okay, you don't know if you can do that. We heard testimony yesterday about performative reconciliation. If the Liberal government is not recovering money, referring to the RCMP and implementing measures to ensure contracts actually go to First Nation communities, is the Trudeau government guilty of performative reconciliation?
It's not something I'm able to answer. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
That is our time.